Hello, friends. Welcome to the underside of history, where logic just turns off. Do you think everything can be explained in our world, but accidents are so small things? And here it is not. I have stories in my hands that prove our world is one continuous madness. Here are collected stories about incredible luck, crazy decisions and events that changed everything, but which for some reason were forgotten. We are starting a cycle, after which you will understand that reality is much cooler than any fiction. Friends, there are 2,000 of us. I want to say a huge thank you to each of you. I am insanely pleased that you are with me. Please support this video with a like, and I will be very interested to know where you are watching me from. Write your city in the comments. We're starting. Story number 1. The Jokers Will That Turn the Birth of Children into the Olympic Games? Imagine Toronto, the year 1926. A gloomy day when the respected lawyer and financier Charles Vance Miller left this world. His colleagues and relatives gathered in the notary's office with lean faces, waiting for the boring separation of shares and real estate. They knew Miller as a successful businessman, but few people guessed that the most sophisticated troll of his time lived in the soul of this respectable gentleman. Charles considered human greed to be the funniest vice and finally decided to arrange a show. A ticket to which cost him his entire fortune. When the notary began to read the will, the silence in the room was replaced by a puzzled whisper, and then stifled cries of indignation. Miller distributed his assets with a jewelry mockery. He bequeathed the shares of the brewing company to 3 of the most ardent teetotaler priests, who had been struggling with alcohol all their lives. The racetrack shares went to the opponents of gambling. Each of them had to choose: accept the hated sinful money, or give up wealth. Miller was probably giggling in his coffin, imagining their torment, but it was just a warm-up before the main attraction. At the end of the document, there was a hidden item that the newspapermen would later call the Big Stork Derby. Miller bequeathed the remainder of his vast fortune, the equivalent of millions of dollars by today's standards, to the woman from Toronto who, within 10 years after his death, would give birth to the largest number of children. At first it was taken as a joke. Lawyers tried to challenge the will, calling it immoral and contradictory. Public order. But Miller was an excellent lawyer. The document was drawn up flawlessly. And then history knocked on the door. 3 years after the Joker's death, the Great Depression struck. The joke suddenly stopped being funny and turned into the only chance of salvation for dozens. Those who find themselves on the verge of poverty. The strangest race in Canadian history has begun. Poor neighborhoods of Toronto were gripped by demographic fever. Women who, in normal times, might have been limited to 2 or 3 heirs, have now turned motherhood into a strategic business plan. Newspapers published tournament tables as if it was a hockey championship. Bookmakers accepted bets. Society was divided. Some condemned greed. Others saw mothers as heroines, trying to ensure the future of their child in the cold. Nature, of course, has made its own adjustments. Those who had twins were eliminated, but in the dead, or those who could not conceive. Conditions were tough. Only children born in a legal marriage and registered in Toronto were considered. 10 years later, in 1936, the finish line was crossed. The court had to determine the winner. Passions were heated to the limit. As a result, the main prize had to be divided. 4 women, Annie Smith, Kathleen Nagel, Lucy Timlick, and Isabel McLean, gave birth to 9 children in 10 years. Each of them received a huge sum that allowed them to buy houses, give their children an education, and forget about poverty forever. 2 more women, some of whose children were stillborn, received consolation prizes. Charles Miller wanted to laugh at greed and puritanical morality, but in the end, his cynical trick saved dozens of children from starvation and provided a comfortable life for several large families. He proved that even from the grave, you can run a city if you have a sense of humor and a checkbook. This is a story about how one signature on paper changed the demographics of a megalopolis. But our next hero had neither money nor a legal education. He had only one desire: to hide, so that even the most powerful army in the world would not find him. And to do this, he had to turn his house into an impregnable fortress, which he carried with him. By the way, friends, for the most curious, I left links to all the primary sources in the description. Take a look, and we continue. Story number 2. The Man Who Became a Tree. France, 1915. The Western Front turned into a meat grinder, where the life of an infantryman was measured in minutes. No man's land, a strip of mud between the trenches of the Germans and the Allies, was the deadliest place on the planet. Any movement there was punished instantly. A sniper bullet or an artillery salvo turned into a Melchik in memories. The generals needed information. They needed to see what was happening in the enemy's camp, but how to get close if every centimeter is shot through. The solution that the British engineers found sounds like the ravings of a crazy carpenter, but it was a brilliant act of military surrealism. They decided to send a spy to the front line, who would hide not behind cover, but inside nature itself. At dusk, when the cannonade subsided for a second, a group of artists and engineers, under the command of Solomon J. Solomon, a man who painted portraits of aristocrats before the war, and now engaged in camouflage, crawled out into no man's land. Their target was one particular Warsgard tree. A dry willow, split by a shell, stuck out in the middle of the field of death, blistering the eyes of both sides of the front. For several months, the Germans got used to it. It became part of the landscape. Under the cover of night and the roar of distracting artillery fire, engineers did the unthinkable. They cut down a real tree by the root and dragged it to the rear. And in its place, centimeter by centimeter, an exact copy was placed. It wasn't wood, it was a steel pipe, upholstered with the bark of a real tree, painted by artists with photographic accuracy. It was cramped inside this trunk, like in a coffin, but there was an armored seat, a periscope, and a telephone cable going underground. Before dawn, an observer climbed inside this steel capsule. The door, disguised as a piece of bark, slammed shut. Morning was coming. Imagine yourself in the place of this soldier. You are sitting inside a narrow metal pipe in the middle of a field where the bodies of your comrades are rotting. The German positions are several tens of meters away. You can hear their conversations, smell their tobacco and strip. Through the tiny holes, you see all their movements, and whisper the coordinates over the artillery phone. One awkward movement, one lens flare, one sneeze, and the tree will turn into your grave. The Germans, realizing that the tree is looking at them, will not just shoot it, but will smash it into splinters from heavy guns. The shift lasted from dawn to dusk, and sometimes a day. Inside the steel tree in summer, it was hot as in a furnace, and in winter the metal sucked the heat out of the body. You couldn't go to the toilet, you couldn't stretch your legs. It was the torture of being motionless in the center of a hurricane. These OP trees, observation posts, have been at the front for years. The Germans, by the way, also came up with this idea, and sometimes on the battlefield, two fake trees silently watched each other, while people were dying around them. It was a war where even nature wore steel armor. This soldier survived due to the fact that he became absolutely motionless, merging with the landscape. But our next hero, in order to survive, had to do exactly the opposite. He had to run for so long, and in such an area where even camels drop dead, and at the same time, drink something that a normal person would not dare to bring to his lips even at gunpoint. Story number 3. A cocktail of bats and crazy hope. Morocco, April 1994. The Sahara Desert. Imagine a place where the sun is not just shining, but trying to destroy you. The Marathon des Sables starts here. Sand Marathon. It's not just running, it's 250 kilometers of hell, divided into 6 stages. Participants sign papers in which they indicate in advance where to send the body in case of failure. Among the daredevils is Mora Prosperi, a 39-year-old Italian policeman and pentathlete. He is in great shape, confident, and ready to conquer the dune. But Sahara had other plans. On the 4th day of the competition, the horizon disappeared. A sandstorm of such force began that the sand peeled off the skin like sandpaper. Visibility dropped to 0. According to the rules, the participant must stop and wait for help. But Mora, afraid of being buried alive, decided to keep moving. He tied a scarf over his face and ran for 8 hours in a row, thinking that he was moving to the finish line. When the wind died down, he found himself in an absolute ringing void. The landscape has changed beyond recognition. There were no tracks, there were no landmarks. He was the only one on the planet, consisting of red-hot silicon. He had half a bottle of water left for the next 9 days. What happened next looks like a hallucination. Mora was walking. When the water ran out, he started drinking his own urine, a survival classic that only works for a short time. But soon the body stopped secreting fluid, and then he stumbled upon an abandoned Muslim marabud, a tiny tomb in the middle of the sands. Hope flared up and went out. There were no people inside, no well, but there were bats nesting under the ceiling. Hunger and thirst erased the edge of disgust. The Italian officer, accustomed to pasta and espresso, turned into a predator. He caught bats with his hands, tore off their heads and drank their blood. It was a thick, nauseating liquid, but it gave him moisture and protein. He sucked out the entrails of these winged creatures so as not to die. He spent 9 days in the desert. He saw mirages, rescue helicopters that flew by without noticing a tiny dot on the sand. He tried to eat lizards and bugs. His liver almost failed, his eyes were sunken, and his weight dropped by 15 kilograms. The skin was blackened and cracked so that he looked like a mummy. In the end, he saw a shepherdess girl. He thought it was another mirage, but she was afraid of his appearance and ran away. Mora followed her and went out to the camp of the Tuareg nomads. It turned out that he ran away from the marathon track for almost 300 kilometers. Moreover, he crossed the border and was in Algeria, the country with which Morocco had a strained relationship. The first thing the border guards did when the half-dead runner was brought to them, they blindfolded him, suspecting him of espionage. Mora Prosperia didn't just survive. A few years later, he returned to the same marathon again and ran it to the end. Apparently, he wanted to make sure that this time the desert would not catch up with him. Mora struggled with the silence and loneliness that drove him crazy. But the heroes of our next story faced the opposite problem. They were gripped by an epidemic that forced people to make sounds against their will. And this virus turned out to be more contagious than the plague. Story number 4. A laugh that made me want to cry. Tanganyika, now Tanzania, January 30th, 1962. Imagine a missionary boarding school for girls in the village of Kashasha. It is a place of strict rules, starched collars, and reverent silence. The students sit at their desks, listening to the monotonous voice of the teacher. Outside the window, the humid African heat. There is discipline inside, stretched like a string. Nothing foreshadowed trouble, except perhaps boredom. And suddenly, the 3 students started giggling. At first, it was the usual suppressed laugh, familiar to any schoolboy who tries not to laugh at the most inopportune moment. The teacher frowned, demanding silence, but the girls did not shut up. Their laughter grew louder, turning into hysterical laughter, from which tears stood out in their eyes. They gasped, clutched their bellies, fell to the floor, shaking in convulsions of fun. But there was no joy in their eyes. There was a fright. They couldn't stop. What started as a prank by 3 teenagers instantly turned into a forest fire. The virus spread to the neighboring desks. After an hour, the whole class was laughing. By evening, the epidemic had spread to the bedroom. 95 out of 159 students were affected by this strange ailment. It was a hard and pleasant laugh. These were seizures that lasted from several hours to 16 days. The girls screamed, cried, rolled on the ground, some fainted from exhaustion. The school administration was horrified. The doctors threw up their hands. No physical causes, no viruses or bacteria. On March 18, 1962, the school had to be closed. The students were sent home to their parents, hoping that they would calm down in their native walls. This was a fatal mistake. The girls spread the infection to their villages. In the village of Anchamba, where several students returned, the epidemic broke out with renewed vigor, hitting 217 people. Not only children laughed, but also adult men and women. People stopped working in the fields, couldn't cook, couldn't sleep. The epidemic has spread to thousands of people in the vicinity of Lake Victoria. 14 schools were closed. The phenomenon lasted a year and a half. Scientists will later call it a mass psychogenic illness, a collective hysteria caused by stress from the collision of traditional African foundations with a rigid European education system. The psyche of teenagers could not stand the pressure, and found the only available way out: unrestrained, frightening animal laughter. Nature has played a cruel joke here, proving that even the most positive emotion can become torture if you remove the stop button. In Tanganyika, people lost control of their emotions. But our next hero lost something more tangible: his right to rest after death. He was dragged out of the grave, not for the sake of science or reburial, but to be judged according to the strictness of the law. And this trial has become the darkest farce in the history of religion. Story number 5. The defendants who decomposed right in the hall. Rome, January 897. The Eternal City is immersed in the dark Middle Ages, where the intrigues of the Vatican are sharper than the daggers of assassins. A court session is being prepared in the Lateran Basilica, the main cathedral of the Western world. Cardinals, bishops, and nobles gathered. The air is heavy, but not from holiness or fear, but from a sickening smell, which even thick incense cannot cope with. All eyes are riveted on the throne on which the defendant is sitting. He is dressed in luxurious papal vestments on the head of a tiara, but his face is gray-green, and his eye sockets are empty. The defendant is silent for a good reason. He's been dead for 9 months. This event will go down in history as a difficult synod, the most terrible farce in the history of the Catholic Church. Pope Stephen VI, overcome by paranoia and hatred of his predecessor, Pope Formos, ordered his body to be exhumed. In order to be judged according to the strictness of canon law, the corpse was dragged out of the sarcophagus, dressed in brocade and gold, and seated on the throne. To prevent the body from falling, it was tied with ropes. A deacon, trembling with horror, was placed next to him, whose task was to answer questions on behalf of the dead man. Imagine the absurdity of this scene. The living Pope Stephan runs around the throne, splashing saliva and shouting at the decomposing body. "How dare you usurp the throne of Saint Peter?" The deacon, stuttering, tried to imitate the voice of a calm one, uttering an excuse, but Stephan was inexorable. The court found the corpse guilty. The punishment was to match the insanity of the process. The papal robes were torn from the dead man, leaving him in rags. 3 fingers of his right hand were cut off, the same ones with which the Pope gave a blessing. But even that didn't seem enough. The mutilated body was dragged through the streets of Rome, to the hooting of the crowd, and thrown into a mass grave for foreigners. Later it was dug up again, and thrown into the Tiber, as if falling. The irony of fate, or divine intervention, was that during this blasphemous synod, the walls of the basilica were shaken by an earthquake. The Romans took this as a sign. Soon Stephen VI himself was overthrown and strangled in prison, and the body of the long-suffering Formosa was fished out by the monks and reburied with honors. The Vatican tried to forget this episode as a bad dream, officially forbidding in the future to judge the dead. Apparently, they decided that the dead have enough problems in the next world without earthly lawyers. Papa Formosus was the victim of a political theater where his own death was the main setting. But our next hero was a different kind of theater director. He sold tickets to a paradise that existed only in his imagination, and forced hundreds of people to board ships, to sail to a country that had never been on the map. Story number 6. The Prince of a Non-Existent Empire. London, October 18, 22. In the high society of the British capital, there is only talk about a mysterious hero who arrived from South America. His name is Sir Gregor MacGregor. He is tall, stately, his chest is hung with orders, and his manners are impeccable. He calls himself the cacique, the supreme ruler of the Principality of the Belt. None of the London bankers and aristocrats have any idea where this belt is located. But MacGregor tells so convincingly that it is considered bad form to doubt the existence of this paradise on Earth. MacGregor launched perhaps the most audacious marketing campaign of the 19th century. He claimed that the belt was a thriving colony on the Mosquito Coast, modern Honduras. According to his colorful booklets, and even a specially published book written by himself under a pseudonym, the rivers there were teeming with gold nuggets, the soil yielded crops 3 times a year, and the local Indians were so friendly that they were just waiting how to serve British gentlemen. In the capital of the belt, the city of St. Joseph, there were allegedly already an opera house, a cathedral, and a parliament building. Hysteria gripped London. Investors, fired up by the recent successes of colonial trade, carried their savings to MacGregor in bags. The Scottish Highlanders sold their farms to buy land in the belt. MacGregor was selling not just land plots, he was selling positions in the government, ranks in the non-existent army, and even the dollar belt currency, which he printed in a neighboring printing house. He earned the equivalent of billions of pounds today. In 1823, 2 ships, Honduras Beg and Kennersley Castle, with 250 colonists on board, sailed to the promised shores. People brought with them the best dresses, pianos and sets, preparing for high life in the tropics. When they arrived at the place, they were greeted by the deafening silence of the jungle. There was no city of St. Joseph. There was no port, no opera, no roads. There was only a wild swampy shore teeming with mosquitoes and crocodiles. The friendly natives turned out to be a few Indians, who looked with surprise at the white people landing in the swamp with a piano. Reality struck the settlers with a blow of malaria and yellow fever. There was no gold in the rivers, and the fertile land was unsuitable for agriculture without cutting down centuries-old forests. The colonists began to die. They were waiting for help from MacGregor, believing that the captain had simply confused the bay, but help did not come. Out of 250 people, less than 50 survived. They were rescued by a passing vessel from British Belize. When the news reached London, MacGregor had already managed to escape to Paris, where he tried to pull off the same scam again. Surprisingly, he never suffered a serious punishment, and died in his bed in Venezuela, receiving a general's pension. Gregor McGregor sold people air disguised as paradise. But the heroes of our next story managed to lose not money, but an entire army, and for this they did not even need an enemy. 1 barrel of schnapps and a language barrier were enough. Story number 7. A battle won by 3 barrels of schnapps. Austria, May 17, 1788. Before dawn, on the outskirts of the town of Karish by the Timish River, the Austrian army is preparing for an offensive. They are sure that somewhere ahead, the enemy army of the Ottoman Empire is hiding behind the river. The scouts reported the presence of the Turks, and today they will destroy them. In fact, there were no Turks nearby. 1. The Ottomans were still preparing for an offensive on another sector of the front, but the Austrian soldiers were not aware of this. There was a lively anticipation in the camp. The officers distributed schnapps to the soldiers to raise morale before the battle. German soldiers are known to be tough guys, and a few drinks of alcohol did them good. They became louder, bolder, and, as it turned out later, completely unable to distinguish an enemy from a friend. Dividing into groups to cross the river and take the enemy in a pincer, the soldiers began to cross Timish. One group, having moved, decided that they got the best loot, 3 barrels with the same combat schnapps left on the shore. They opened 1 barrel and began to drink, loudly having fun. Soon another group of Austrian soldiers, hearing the noise, decided that the Germans had already started looting. They rushed to the barrels, shouting, "The Germans, rather, they drink our prey." A scuffle began. The soldiers were already very drunk and mistook each other for enemies. The shooting started. "Turks, Turks, they are here!" Drunken soldiers shouted, shooting at each other. The generals, who did not have time to cross the river, heard the shots and decided that their army was ambushed. They ordered the artillery to open fire on their own troops. Darkness, alcohol, and panic have done their job. Thousands of Austrian soldiers, mistaking their comrades for enemies, killed each other. Some fell into the river, trying to escape from Turkish bullets, and drowned. About 10,000 people were killed or wounded. When the real Ottoman troops entered the battlefield at dawn, they saw a picture of complete devastation. Thousands of dead bodies, broken carts, and smoking wreckage. The Turks were confused. "What happened here?" they asked. "Where is the enemy?" There was not a single Turkish soldier on the battlefield. The enemy's attack, which was to take place only the next day, was prevented by the forces of the Austrian army itself. They lost the battle without even starting it, and without having time to meet with a real opponent. This battle has become the most absurd in the history of wars, showing that sometimes the most terrible enemy is not the one who stands opposite, but the one who sits next to you in the trench. And especially if he also drank too much. Our heroes were fighting an imaginary opponent, but the next heroine was fighting a reality that was much more monstrous. She was left alone in the midst of hostile nature, where every step could be the last, and survived thanks to the fact that she learned not just to survive, but also to see the world as no one has seen it. Story number 8. Shvia, who defeated the icy hell, and the cat. Wrangel Island, September 19, 21. Imagine a piece of rock in the Arctic Ocean, where winter lasts for 9 months, and the wind is able to tear the meat from the bones. An expedition arrives here under the auspices of the famous polar explorer Hjalmar Stephenson. The goal is ambitious to the point of absurdity, to claim the rights of Canada and Britain to this deserted island, just by living there for a couple of years. The team consists of 4 young enthusiastic Americans and 1 woman. Her name is Ada Blackjack. She is 23 years old. She is an Inuit, but grew up in a Methodist mission, is scared of polar bears to the point of fainting, does not know how to shoot, and has never lived in the wild. She was hired as a seamstress and cook. She needed money for the treatment of her son with tuberculosis. She thought she was going on an easy adventure with experienced gentlemen. She didn't know she had bought a one-way ticket. The first year passed tolerably well, but in the summer of 1922, the ship with supplies could not break through the ice. The island was under blockade. The food was running out. The guys, confident in their invulnerability, decided to make a mad march across the ice to Siberia for help. 3 of them went into the white haze and disappeared forever. Their bodies were never found. Ada stayed on the island with one of the Americans, Lauren Knight, who was too sick with anger to go. And that's where the incredible transformation begins. Little timid Shvia, who used to shudder at the noise of the wind, was left alone with a dying man and an expedition cat named Vic. Nade, going mad with pain and hunger, turned into a tyrant. He shouted at Ada, accused her of not trying hard enough, and demanded food. Ada took care of him, cleaned up the sewage, endured insults, and learned to kill. She took the rifle. At first, she was afraid to pull the trigger, but hunger is the best teacher. She learned to set traps for Arctic foxes. She built an observation tower out of driftwood to look out for bears before they see her. She, a woman who had never held anything heavier than a needle in her hands, began to carry heavy carcasses of seals. In June 1923, Nade died. Ada was left completely alone. Only she is a cat, and thousands of kilometers of ice. In order not to go crazy in this ringing silence, where the sky merges with the earth, and the northern lights seem to be a living being, Ada started a diary. She was typing on a typewriter left behind by the expedition. She was talking to a cat. She was talking to a picture of her son. In moments of extreme exhaustion, when the boundaries of reality were erased, it seemed to her that the colors around her were getting a taste, and the howling of the wind was forming into words. On August 19, 1923, after 2 years of isolation, the Donaldson schooner made its way to the island. Rescuers expected to find corpses. Instead, they saw a neatly sewn parka of skins, a smoking hearth, and Ada, who came out to them holding a cat in her arms. She didn't just survive, she kept the expedition equipment and diaries. Ada Blackjack returned home, cured her son, and lived a long life avoiding fame. She always said, "I just wanted to live." And the cat Vic, the only polar explorer cat who survived such a Robinsonade, became a legend in narrow circles. Ada survived thanks to instincts she didn't know she had. But our next hero survived against all logic, physics, and medicine. An object that was supposed to kill an elephant entered his body. But instead of a funeral, this case gave the world a new era in understanding the human brain. Story number 9, Through Wound Personality. Cavendish, Vermont, September 13th. Hot afternoon. A team of workers is laying a railway, blasting rock. They are led by Phineas Gage, a 25-year-old foreman, whom the authorities consider the best in his field. He is as reliable as a rock, as accurate as a Swiss watch, and as polite as a gentleman. He has a bright future. But in a second, he will have only a brilliant past. Gage puts a charge of gunpowder in the pit. His tool is a special Prombovokny scrap. This is a terrible iron stick with a length of more than a meter, a thickness of 3 cm, and a weight of 6 kg. Pointed at one end. Gage is distracted by the conversation behind his back, turns his head, and hits a stone with a crowbar. A spark. The explosion happens instantly. The crowbar, like a projectile fired from a cannon, flies out of the pit. It enters the Phineas under the left cheekbone, passes through the brain, breaks through the skull on the top of the head, and, describing an arc, lands in the shower. 25 meters behind, covered with blood and particles of gray matter. Any other person would have died before the body even touched the ground. But what happened next scared the workers more than the explosion itself. Phineas Gage is not dead. He was thrown back. He convulsed several times and then sat up. A few minutes later, leaning on the shoulders of dumbfounded colleagues, he went to the cart to go to town. On the way, he calmly talked about the weather and the entries in the work log. When Dr. Edward Harlow drove up to the hotel where the wounded man was accommodated, Gage was sitting on the veranda. When he saw the doctor, he spat out blood and uttered a phrase that went down in the history of medicine with grim irony. "Doctor, there's a lot of work for you here." Harlow looked into the wound on his head and saw a throbbing brain. He couldn't believe his eyes. The patient was conscious and thinking sensibly, having a hole in his head, through which you could stick a billiard ball. Phineas survived. The wound festered, he fell into a coma, but thanks to the incredible health and care of Dr. Harlow, he recovered. A couple of months later, he was walking around the city. Physically, he was healthy. But soon friends and colleagues realized a terrible thing. Gage survived, but Phineas, the iron pond that pierced the frontal lobes of the brain, performed the most brutal lobotomy in history. The responsible, polite, and purposeful foreman disappeared. In his place appeared a capricious, rude, impatient, and foul-mouthed man, unable to make plans for the future. Gage is no longer Gage, acquaintances said sadly. He was fired from the railroad because he became unbearable. He lived for another 12 years, wandering around the country, working as a coachman in Chile, and showing himself and his famous crowbar at Barnum's Circus in New York. He never parted with this piece of iron, considering it his talisman. This case became the foundation of neuroscience. Gage proved with his broken life that personality, character, and morality live in a specific part of the brain, and they can be destroyed with one blow, leaving the body alive. Phineas Gage lost himself, but became immortal in textbooks. But the heroes of our next story lost nothing but their conscience. They created a mechanism that fooled emperors and scientists for half a century, forcing everyone to believe that a machine could think better than a person, although the secret was simple and tight as a coffin. Story number 10. The chess player who wasn't breathing. Almost. Vienna 1770. The whole flower of the Austrian nobility gathered at the court of Empress Maria Theresa. In the center of the hall, there is a miracle of technology, created by the court advisor Wolfgang von Kempelen. This is a large wooden box, behind which sits a life-size doll, dressed in a Turkish kaftan and turban. The Turk has a long pipe in his hand, a chessboard in front of him. Von Kempelen opens the drawer doors with the air of a magician. Inside is a complex system of gears, levers, and brass cylinders. The audience gasps. It's pure mechanics. No cheating. The inventor starts the mechanism with a key. A loud grinding of springs is heard. The Turk slowly raises his hand, takes the piece, and makes a move. The game begins. One of the courtiers sits down opposite the car. The Turk plays hard, aggressive, and unmistakably. If the opponent is nervous, the machine knocks on the table and returns the piece to its place. That evening, the mechanical man defeated all the rivals. Vienna was in shock. The world has seen artificial intelligence for the first time. Mechanical Turk went on tour in Europe and America. He beat Benjamin Franklin in Paris. He checkmated Napoleon Bonaparte. The emperor, by the way, tried to cheat 3 times, and in the end the Turk swept all the pieces off the board in protest. He drove Edgar Allan Poe crazy, who wrote an entire essay trying to solve the mystery of the automaton. People believed that science had peaked, that gears could think. But the truth was much more prosaic. There was no magic brain inside the box. There was a system of mirrors and an ingenious partition. When Kempelen opened one door, the internal parts shifted, creating the illusion that the box was full of mechanics. In fact, there was free space to accommodate a person, but not an ordinary person. Inside the stuffy dark box, a living grandmaster was crouched in 3 deaths. Over the years, this role has been played by the best chess players in Europe: Johann Elgar, William Lewis, Jack Moray. They controlled the Turk's hand with a complex system: levers, pantograph. They followed the progress of the game on a small board inside, receiving information through magnets under the main board. When the figure rose, the magnet descended. Imagine their work. To sit for hours in the fetal position, inhaling the smell of candle soot. A candle was burning inside for lighting. Her smoke was discharged through the Turk's pipe to hide the smell, listening to the rasping of springs, drowning out their own breathing and coughing. They were invisibles, geniuses whose victories were attributed to a soulless doll. One of the operators, they say, was a war veteran who lost his legs. It was the only way he could fit comfortably in the box. Another almost died from the heat during the performance. The mechanical Turk was the greatest illusion of the Enlightenment era, proving that people would rather believe in a miracle machine than in the talent of a man hidden in a box. 80 years later, the machine gun burned down in a fire at the Philadelphia Museum. It is said that before the fire engulfed him, the Turk made a strange sound, like a sigh of relief. The Turk fooled the elite, but our next hero did not try to deceive anyone. He just wanted to prove that a person is capable of anything, even if he has nothing but the desire to live. He has made an escape that will make you take a fresh look at the possibilities of the human body in conditions of absolute cold. Story number 11. Escape from the ice coffin. Siberia, winter of 1942. Gulag. Camps for prisoners of war, lost in the endless taiga, where the frost reaches -40 degrees. Slawomir Ravik, a Polish officer arrested by the NFT on false charges of espionage, got here. The sentence is 25 years of hard labor. In these places, it meant the death penalty, stretched over time. People died here from hunger, scurvy, and overwork. Escape was not considered impossible because of the barbed wire, and because of geography, thousands of kilometers of snow, wolves, and lack of food. But Ravich decided that it was better to die in a free snowdrift than as a slave in a sawmill. On Easter night, when the guards relaxed their vigilance, Ravich and 6 other prisoners were 3 Poles, a Latvian, a Lithuanian, and an American named Mr. Smith cut the wire and disappeared in a blizzard. They had only a homemade knife, an axe, and some crackers. Their plan was crazy. They were not going to go to the west, where there was a war. They decided to go south, through Siberia, through Mongolia, through the Gobi Desert, through the Himalayas, to India. It was a death march of 6,000 kilometers long. The first enemy was the cold. They slept, huddled close to each other so as not to freeze. Snakes and frogs were barely caught in the bark of trees. Soon they were joined by the fugitive Christina, a young Polish woman who escaped from the collective farm. Now there were 8 of them. In Mongolia, they faced the heat and aridity of the Gobi Desert. Imagine the transition from Siberian frosts to hot sand. Christina died first, unable to withstand dehydration. Then one of the Poles died. The rest drank the blood of the slaughtered animals. And they walked, turning into living skeletons, covered with parchment skin. Their shoes fell apart, they wrapped their feet in rags and skins, and then the Himalayas, walls of ice and stone stood in front of them. Without climbing equipment, without oxygen tanks, exhausted to the limit, they began to climb. They lost to more in the mountains. They slept in snow caves, hallucinated from hypoxia. Ravitch later claimed to have seen strange eddy creatures in the mountains. But no one knows if it was the truth or the games of a dying mind. 11 months after the escape in March 1942, the 4 survivors descended to India. They came across a British patrol. The soldiers couldn't believe their eyes. In front of them were ghost-like creatures with frostbite-blackened faces and long hair. Slavomir Ravitch walked halfway around the world. His book The Long Walk became a bestseller, although many researchers still argue about the reliability of some details of the route. But the fact remains that people escaped from the Gulag and survived in inhumane conditions, driven only by the fury of life. This is a story about overcoming physical boundaries, but the next chapter will tell about overcoming moral boundaries. Our hero was an ordinary postal clerk until he decided that he could become the Emperor of the USA. And the most amazing thing is that the people believed him. Story number 12. The Emperor who ruled without an army, but with love. San Francisco, September 17, 1859. A strange man comes into the editorial office of the newspaper bulletin. He is dressed in a worn but neat military uniform with gilded epaulets. There's a rusty saber on his side. His gaze is clear, his posture is majestic. He hands the editor a piece of paper and politely asks to publish a proclamation. The editor, deciding that this is a great joke to fill the strip, prints the text. The next morning, the city wakes up in a new reality. The newspaper says in black and white, "I, Joshua Norton, at the request of the overwhelming majority of citizens of these United States, I declare myself the Emperor of this country." Thus began the kindest and most surreal chapter in American history. Joshua Norton was a bankrupt businessman who lost his mind after a failed rice deal. Instead of putting him in a madhouse, San Francisco decided to play along. Norton I ruled for 21 years, and it was a reign that many real monarchs would envy. He issued decrees that newspapers printed. He dissolved the US Congress, by the power of his word, of course, because corruption was rampant there. He ordered the construction of a bridge between San Francisco and Oakland, which turned out to be nonsense at the time. But the Bay Bridge was built there half a century later. He taxed the banks, and surprisingly, the bankers paid. The city adored its emperor. Restaurants fed him for free, and in return, he put a seal approved by the Imperial Majesty, which instantly increased the flow of customers. Theaters reserved a box for him. When his old uniform was worn out, the city council allocated money for a new uniform. The police saluted him in the streets. One day a young patrolman, new in town, arrested Norton for vagrancy. The scandal was huge. The newspapers shouted about arbitrariness. The chief of police personally released the emperor and made a public apology. Norton, showing the monarch's generosity, granted the policeman forgiveness. Since then, every policeman in the city has been obliged to greet His Majesty. Norton wasn't just a city lunatic, he was the conscience of the city. During the anti-Chinese pogroms, he stood between the angry crowd and the residents of Chinatown. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he just bowed his head and began to say a prayer. The crowd, embarrassed by the sight of their beloved monarch, dispersed. He stopped the violence without firing a shot. When Norton I died of apoplexy on the street on January 8, 1880, San Francisco was plunged into mourning. 30,000 people from millionaires to beggars came to his funeral. The funeral procession stretched for 3 kilometers. The headlines read, "The King is dead." Joshua Norton proved that power is not bayonets and laws, but love and respect that you give to people, even if this power exists only in your head. Emperor Norton ruled a fictional empire in the real world. But the heroine of the following story ruled a real empire while dead. Her coronation took place after the heart stopped beating, and the subjects kissed the hand of the corpse as a sign of loyalty. Story number 13. The Queen Who Ascended the Throne from the Grave. Coimbra, Portugal, 1357. There is an oppressive silence in the throne room of the cathedral. All the nobility of the kingdom, knights, bishops gathered. They're scared. King Pedro I, nicknamed the Cruel, sits on the throne. His gaze is mad and full of pain. A second throne is installed next to it. On it sits a figure in a luxurious dress, studded with precious stones. On his head is a golden crown. The face is hidden by a veil. The king stands up and announces, "Welcome your queen, Inés de Castro." He tears off the veil. The audience gasps. Under the veil, the mummified face of a woman killed 2 years ago. The skin is dry, the eye sockets are empty, but Pedro looks at her with the tenderness of a lover. This is the culmination of the most tragic and terrible love story in the history of Europe. Inés was the maid of honor that Prince Pedro fell in love with. But his father, King Afonso IV, was against this union. Inés was Spanish, and the king was afraid of the political influence of her brothers. Pedro, however, secretly married Inés, and they had children. King Afonso solved the problem radically. While the prince was hunting, he sent 3 assassins to Inés, who beheaded her in front of the children. When Pedro found out about the death of his beloved, his grief turned into the rage of a berserker. He rebelled against his father, ravaging the north of the country. After the death of his father, becoming king, Pedro first of all found a way to kill. His revenge was monstrous. He personally tore the hearts out of their chests, one from the back, the other from the chest, while they were still alive. But revenge did not bring Inés back. And then Pedro decided to do something that death could not do. He ordered the exhumation of Inés's body from the Santa Clara monastery. He dressed the decaying corpse in royal robes and seated it on the throne. The coronation ceremony began. By order of the king, every courtier, every count and baron who had despised Inés in life, or remained silent when she was killed, had to go to the throne, kneel, and kiss the withered hand of the dead queen as a sign of loyalty. Imagine this horror, the smell of decay mixed with the scent of perfume, cold blood, the bone under his lips, and the mad gaze of the king, watching every move. To refuse meant death. After the ceremony, Inés's body was transferred with the greatest honors to the monastery of Alcobas. Pedro ordered to put his sarcophagus in front of her sarcophagus, feet to feet. His idea was simple and romantic to the point of trembling. On the day of judgment, when the dead will rise, the first thing Pedro will see when he opens his eyes will be the face of his beloved Inés. On the marble of their tombs is carved the inscription "Et au fim du mundo," until the end of the world. Pedro tried to conquer death with love. But our next hero defeated death by simply not showing up for it. He was the only person who was late for his own funeral, and this saved not only his life, but also the life of an entire nation. Story number 14. The Man Who Overslept the Eruption. Saint-Pierre, Martinique Island, May 8, 1902. This is the Paris of the Caribbean, a thriving city full of life, commerce and laughter. The Montagne Pilate mountain rises above it. The volcano had been smoking for several days, but the governor assured residents that there was no danger. The elections were on the nose, and the evacuation of the electorate was not part of his plans. Ludger Silberus, or Ludovic, as he was called, is sitting in the prison of the city. He is neither a hero nor a villain, but an ordinary debasher. The day before, he had a drunken fight and wounded a friend with a saber. The police threw him into the most secure cell, a semi-underground stone solitary cell with no windows, thick walls, and one narrow slit for air above a powerful steel door. Silberus was furious, shouting and cursing the judges, not knowing that this stone bag was the only ticket to life. At 7:52 a.m., the mountain exploded. It wasn't a slow lava flow. It was a pyroclastic flow, a cloud of incandescent gas, ash and rocks rushing at a speed of hundreds of kilometers per hour. The temperature inside the stream reached 1,000 degrees. He covered the Saint-Pierre in a matter of seconds. The city has disappeared. Houses flashed like matches. People burned instantly, without even having time to understand what had happened. Barrels of rum and warehouses exploded, adding fire. 30,000 people died in 2 minutes. In Havana, the water boiled, destroying the ships. In his stone cell, Silberus felt the air suddenly become hot, like in a furnace. The darkness became absolute. Incandescent ash penetrated through the crack above the door, burning his back, arms and legs. He fell to the floor, covering his face with sweat-soaked clothes so as not to inhale the fiery death. He heard a rumble like the roar of 1,000 trains, and screams that stopped in an instant. And then there was silence. He spent 4 days in this red-hot grave. Without water, with severe burns, in complete darkness, surrounded by a dead city. He was shouting, but no one heard him, because there was no one to hear. Only on May 11th, rescuers who were dismantling the ruins of the prison heard faint moans from under the ground. Silberus was one of 2 survivors in the city center. The second was shoemaker Leon Comper-Leander, who miraculously escaped to the outskirts. When he was pulled out, he looked like a demon, covered with a crust of ashes and burns. But he was alive. The governor, who refused to evacuate, died along with everyone. And the drunken prisoner, whom society isolated as a dangerous element, became a celebrity. He was pardoned, because all his accusers and witnesses died. He later joined Barnum and Bailey's circus, where he performed as a man who survived Judgment Day. He showed the public his scars, and told how the walls of the prison saved him from the wrath of nature. Silberus survived because of the thick walls, but the heroes of our next story survived because they didn't have any walls. They drifted in the open ocean, on a piece of rubber surrounded by sharks, and ate what nature herself jumped into their boat, proving that man is the most tenacious animal on earth. Story number 15. A family that was riding the waves on a rubber turtle. Pacific Ocean, June 15, 1972. The yacht Lucid, a beautiful 12-meter schooner, sails from the Galapagos Islands to the Marquesas Islands. The Scottish Robertson family is on board. Dougal, father, a former sailor; Lynn, mother; their children 18-year-old Douglas, 12-year-old twins Neil and Sandy, as well as a fellow student Robin. They sold their farm to fulfill their dream of traveling around the world. At 10 a.m., the dream turned into a nightmare. A thud shook the ship. A flock of killer whales, mistaking the yacht for a whale, attacked Lucid. The holes were fatal. The yacht sank in 60 seconds. The family managed to throw overboard an inflatable fruit, a small fiberglass Eden boat the size of a bathtub, some water, oranges, and a sewing kit. 6 people found themselves in the middle of the largest ocean on the planet. The nearest land is 1,000 kilometers away. The chances of survival are 0. They drifted for 38 days. Water supplies ran out after a few days. The sun burned my skin. But Dougal Robertson, a stern Scot, didn't let panic get the better of him. He introduced iron discipline. They started hunting. They caught flying fish that accidentally fell into the boat. They caught turtles with their hands. Yes, with my bare hands. When the turtle swam up to the raft, they grabbed it by the flipper and dragged it on board. The turtle's blood replaced their water. They ate the meat raw or dried in the sun. The fat was used as a burn cream. They even made an enema out of muddy water extracted from fish ridges so that the body absorbed moisture through the intestines. It sounds terrible, but it saved their lives. On the 17th day, the inflatable fetus began to fall apart. They had to move all 6 of them into Eden's tiny boat. Imagine 6 people in a boat 3 meters long. The water was 10 centimeters from the side. They had to sit in turns, changing places so that the boat would not capsize. Dougal taught the children not to be afraid. He told them stories, made them keep a diary. Lynn, the mother, was the heart of the team, comforting the twins. They became a single organism. On July 23rd, the Japanese fishing trawler Tokamaro noticed a strange object on the horizon. When the fishermen swam closer, they could not believe their eyes. There were 6 people sitting in a small locker. They were emaciated, covered with sores and rags, but they were smiling. Dougal raised his hand and calmly asked to take them on board. They still had some dried turtle meat and water left. Doctors later said that in this mode, they could have lasted another month. The Robertsons didn't just survive. They proved that a family united by a common goal is stronger than the ocean. This case has entered the textbooks on survival. But our next hero survived in an environment where there is no water, no air, no sharks. He became the first person who looked into the eyes of infinity and winked at her, falling from a height where only satellites fly. Story number 16. A man who fell faster than sound and survived. New Mexico, August 16, 1960. Dawn. A huge helium balloon, similar to a silver jellyfish, rises into the sky. A tiny open gondola hangs below it. Captain Joseph Kittinger is sitting inside. He's wearing a pressurized spacesuit that makes him look like a clumsy knight. His goal is to climb to a height of 31 kilometers into the stratosphere, where the sky is already black and the stars are visible even during the day. This is an Excelsior project. The US Air Force wants to know if the pilot can escape from such a height. Kittinger is a guinea pig. The climb took an hour and a half. At an altitude of 13 kilometers, it depressurized the right glove. The arm began to swell. Kittinger knew he had to report this to Earth and abort the mission. But he also knew that he wouldn't be allowed back in. He said nothing. By the time he reached the peak height, his arm was twice as big as usual, and it hurt unbearably, but he continued to work. At an altitude of 31,300 meters, he stood on the edge of the gondola. Below, far, far away, there was a blue planet. Overhead, a cosmic void. He said into the microphone, "Lord, take care of me," and stepped into the abyss. It fell for 4 minutes and 36 seconds. There is almost no resistance in the rarefied air of the stratosphere. Kittinger accelerated to a speed of 988 kilometers per hour. He almost broke the sound barrier with his body. The wind was not whistling in my ears. There was no air to whistle. There was absolute silence. But then the nightmare started. He went into a tailspin. It began to spin at a monstrous speed. On the previous jump, yes, it was his third time, the rotation was so strong, 120 revolutions per minute, that he lost consciousness and was saved only by an automatic parachute. This time, he managed to stabilize the fall with the help of a small braking parachute. He saw the black sky above his head smoothly turn into blue and then into white from the clouds. At an altitude of 5.5 kilometers, the main parachute opened. When he landed in the desert, medics ran up to him. Joseph took off his helmet. His face was pale, his arm swollen to blue, but he was smiling. He became the first person who saw the curve of the earth, not through a porthole, but with his own eyes, hanging in the void. His record lasted 52 years, until it was broken by Felix Baumgartner. But Kittinger was the first. He jumped into the unknown, having the technology of the 60s, with a leaky glove and nerves of steel. Kittinger was falling from the sky, but the heroes of our next story rose from the ground to discover that the world they knew had disappeared. They lived in isolation longer than human life lasts, not knowing that the Second World War was over. Gagarin flew into space, and people invented television. Story number 17. Hermits who missed the 20th century. Caucasia, summer of 1978. A group of geologists is flying by helicopter over a remote taiga in the upper reaches of the Abakan River. This place is marked as impassable on the map. The nearest settlement is 250 kilometers away. Suddenly, the pilot notices a strange spot on the mountainside. This is a vegetable garden. Smooth potato beds in the middle of a wild thicket. Geologists decided to go down and check. They expected to find poachers or fugitive criminals, but what they found was like time travel. On the bank of the stream stood a black, leaning hut, covered with shingles. An old man in rags with a beard to the waist came out of it. He was the boss. Two women were hiding behind him, who, seeing people, became hysterical, shouting something to the side. In Russian. It was the Lykov family of old believers. Karp Lykov, his wife Akalina, who died of starvation in 1961, and their 4 children Savin, Dmitry, Natalia, and Agafia. In the 30s, fleeing from collectivization and persecution of the faith, Karp took his family away to the taiga. They went further and further away until they were completely isolated. They haven't seen a single person for 40 years. The younger children, Agafia and Dmitry, were born already in the forest. They had never seen bread. They did not know what salt was. They've never seen a wheel. Their whole world was limited to the hut, the taiga, and the Bible, according to which they learned to read. Their way of life was primitive. The fire was extracted by chrysolite. Clothes were sewn from hemp, which they grew themselves. Shoes were made of birch bark. When the metal dishes rusted, they learned to make pots of birch bark, in which it was possible to cook food. But the most shocking thing was their ignorance of history. When geologists told them that was the Great Patriotic War, that Germany invaded Russia and was defeated, Kablukov incredulously shook his head. They heard the hum of planes in the sky, but considered it a sign of the end of the world. When they were shown the TV, Agafia was scared, calling it a demonic box, but then watched with childish delight. Contact with civilization became fatal for the family. They had no immunity to common viruses. In 1981, 3 children, Savin, Natalia and Dmitry, died one after the other from pneumonia and kidney problems. Karp died in 1988. Agafia Lykova was left alone. She was offered to move to the village, to a monastery, but she refused. Here is Tyatinka lying, here is Mama. Where will I go? This is my home. She still lives in the taiga, already a very old woman, accepting help from volunteers and the authorities, but refusing to leave her dead end. The Lykovs hid from the world to keep their faith, but the world found them. But our next hero wasn't hiding. On the contrary, he craved attention and recognition. And for this, he was ready to endure pain, humiliation, and even risk his life. Becoming a living exhibit for medical experiments that turned the idea of what is happening in our stomach upside down. Story number 18. A man with a window in his stomach. Mackinac Island, Michigan, June 6, 1822. Imagine an outpost of civilization on the edge of a wild world. The trading post of the American Fur Company is a noisy, dirty, and full of life place where Indians, trappers, and traders exchange skins for furs, whiskey, and trinkets. Among this crowd is 19-year-old Alexis St. Martin, a young and strong French-Canadian voyager. He laughs, drinks, and does not suspect that in a minute, his name will go down in the history of medicine in the most painful way. Suddenly, there is a deafening crash. A gun accidentally went off in a cramped shop. Alexis, who was standing just a meter from the muzzle, receives a shot charge in his left side. The wound was monstrous. A fist-sized hole exposed broken ribs, part of a lung, and a punctured stomach from which yesterday's breakfast was spilling out. In the 19th century, on the frontier, it was 100% a death sentence. But there was a young army surgeon at the fort named William Bowman. Ambitious and curious, he decided to fight for the guy's life. Bowman performed several operations, removed the shot, set the organs, and contrary to all forecasts, Alexis survived. But the wound healed strangely. The edges of the wound on the abdomen fused with the edges of the hole in the stomach, forming a fistula, a permanent non-healing channel leading directly into the organ. When Alexis recovered, there was a hole left on his side, covered only by a flap of skin that could be bent back like a manhole cover and look inside. And then Dr. Beaumont realized what an incredible gift fate had given him. At that time, almost nothing was known about digestion. It was believed that food was ground in the stomach mechanically, like in a mill. Beaumont saw Alexis not as a patient, but as a living laboratory. He hired an illiterate voyager as a servant, and began a series of experiments that today would be considered torture. He tied pieces of meat, bread, and vegetables to a silk thread, and lowered them into the stomach through the holes, like a fisherman casting bait into a mysterious pond. After a few hours, he pulled out the thread, and watched what happened to the food. He collected pure gastric juice by simply sticking a tube through the hole and sending it to chemists. He watched his stomach react to different foods, to anger and to fear. He conducted 56 experiments. For Alexis, these were years of humiliation. He felt like a circus freak. Bowman was obsessed with science, and St. Martin wanted a normal life. He ran away from his benefactor several times, returned to Canada, got married. He had children, but Bowman, realizing that there would be no second such chance, sought him out and persuaded, and sometimes forced him to return, even enlisting him in the army to keep him under control. Thanks to this strange and painful union, William Bowman became the father of gastrophysiology. He proved that digestion is a chemical process and revealed to the world the secrets of gastric juice. And Alexis St. Martin, a man with a window in his stomach, survived his tormentor doctor by 27 years, and died in old age, taking his anatomical anomaly to the grave. Alexis St. Martin became a living laboratory where the body was studied. But in our next story, we will talk about an experiment that was even scarier, because its purpose was not the body, but the mind. It was an attempt to find a button that erases identity and turns a person into a puppet. Story number 19. In Search of a Switch for the Soul. United States, early 1950s. The paranoia of the Cold War hung in the air like a thick poisonous fog. A Soviet spy was seen in every shadow. A nuclear apocalypse was waiting for every corner. American soldiers who returned from Korean captivity told terrible things about brainwashing. It seemed that the communists had found a way to hack into human consciousness, turning enemies into puppets. In Langley's Mellon offices, at the CIA headquarters, gray cardinals in gray suits decided that it was impossible to lag behind in this arms race. If the enemy can control the mind, then so should they. It was necessary to find the key to the human soul. Or, if necessary, a lockpick. In order to protect democracy, they decided to edit it a little in the minds of their own citizens. So the MK Ultra project was born. It wasn't the code name of the operation. It was the name of the darkest Pandora's box the government had ever opened. USA. Under the leadership of chemist Sidney Gottlieb, whom colleagues called a black sorcerer behind his back. the CIA began a series of illegal and monstrous experiments on people. Their goal was to find a substance or method that could control the mind, erase memory, evoke the right emotions, or break the will. They were looking for the very switch that turns a person into an obedient robot. The whole country has become a field for experiments. Doctors in 80 institutions, hospitals, universities, and prisons received funding from CIA shell funds. They gave patients who were being treated for depression or schizophrenia huge doses of LSD, mescaline, and other psychedelics, without telling them about it. They subjected people to sessions of hypnosis, sensory deprivation, put them into a multi-day coma. But the most cynical experiment unfolded on the streets of New York and San Francisco. As part of Operation Midnight Ecstasy, the CIA has equipped several brothels. The rooms were equipped with two-way mirrors and recording equipment. Unsuspecting clients, ordinary American citizens, were secretly drugged with LSD. And agents behind the mirror with notebooks in their hands watched as the drug broke their psyche. They wanted to see if they could get a person to give up their secrets under the influence of acid. The project lasted almost 20 years. Thousands of people have become unwitting guinea pigs. Many of them ended up in mental hospitals with a destroyed personality and erased memories. Some, like scientist Frank Olson, to whom colleagues slipped LSD into a drink, died under mysterious circumstances. When the scandal began to leak to the press in 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all documents on the MKUltra. Most of the records were burned, but a few boxes survived by mistake, and they became proof that in the pursuit of control over someone else's mind, you can easily lose your own. The CIA was trying to turn the human mind into a blank slate that could be rewritten anew. But what if nature created a mind that was the exact opposite? A mind that couldn't forget anything, turning every day it lived into an indelible eternal record. Story number 20. An archive that could not be erased. Moscow, mid-1920s. Imagine the echoing smoky editorial office of a major newspaper. The editor spends the morning briefing, quickly and nervously handing out tasks. He lists dozens of names, addresses, phone numbers. Journalists around are frantically scratching their pens in notebooks, afraid to miss at least one detail. All except one. A young reporter, Solomon Shirashevsky, is standing in the corner. He just looks at the editor, not writing anything down. His calmness looks like arrogance. The editor, noticing this, explodes. "Shirashevsky, are you kidding me? Or do you have a phenomenal memory?" Solomon, confused, replies, "Yes, it seems to be." To teach the lazy man a lesson, the editor orders him to repeat everything that was said. And Shirashevsky repeats, word for word. It reproduces not only the list of addresses, but also random reservations, pauses, even coughing of the editor. The editorial staff freezes. It's not a memory, it's something else. The startled editor sent Solomon to Alexander Lurie, a young but already well-known Soviet neuropsychologist. This is how their 30-year collaboration began, which turned the idea of human memory upside down. Shirashevsky, or as Luria called him in his notes, had an absolute limitless memory. But it was not a gift. It was a curse. His brain was a perfect hard drive, without a delete button, which in the 20s of the last century was more of a technical problem than an advantage. Every word, every number, every sound was not just remembered, they were imprinted in his mind. With an eternal multidimensional stigma, his memory was synesthetic. For him, the number 1 was sharp, and looked like an ice icicle. Luria's voice he perceived as crumbly yellow gravel. The word restaurant evoked in his mind the image of people in tuxedos, the sounds of the orchestra, and the taste of roast beef. Imagine what it's like to read a book when every word gives rise to a storm of uncontrollable images, tastes and sounds that completely obscure the meaning. Text. He couldn't understand abstract concepts because his mind couldn't generalize. He remembered every detail, every particular case. He remembered the face of every passerby he passed 20 years ago. His mind was an archive that constantly received new data, but from which nothing could be obtained. He was desperately trying to learn to forget. He imagined unnecessary memories written on the blackboard, and mentally erased them with a rag, but he saw the remaining chalk stains. He imagined burning them, but he saw the ashes and smelled the smoke. Nothing disappeared. His life was a tragedy. He changed dozens of professions, but could not resist anywhere. As a result, he became a professional mnemonist, a person who remembers meaningless tables of numbers and formulas on stage. He turned his gift, his illness, into a circus act. A man whose brain stored infinity was forced to entertain the crowd by memorizing the sequence of cards in the deck. Solomon Sherashevsky was a prisoner of the ideal mind, locked in a cell, the walls of which were made up of his own memories. But our next heroes were prisoners of an ideal fortress prison on a rock in the middle of an icy bay. Firm where it was believed it was impossible to escape, they proved that even from the most hopeless place, there is a way out if you have spoons, raincoats, and a brilliant plan. Story number 21. Freedom, hollowed out with a spoon. Alcatraz Island, 1960. It's not just a prison, it's the end of the road. A rock in the middle of the icy San Francisco Bay, washed by currents that can drag even an Olympic swimmer to the bottom. From here, they say, there is no escape. Prisoners can see the lights of a big city, hear laughter from passing yachts, but this world is as far away for them as Mars. Alcatraz's motto is simple: if you break the law, you will go to prison. If you break the laws of the prison, you will come to us. Frank Maurice is brought here. He's not a bully, he's not a killer. He is a thief with the intelligence of a genius. His dossier is marked IQ-133. Alcatraz for him is not a sentence, but a chess game, in which he must find the only right move. Soon he finds partners with brothers John and Clarence Emblin, bank robbers with the hands of masters. Together, they begin to cook what is considered impossible. Their plan was audacious, painstaking, and ingenious in its simplicity. They noticed that the concrete around the ventilation grilles in their cells was old and crumbled from the salty moist air. Their main tool was an ordinary spoon stolen by the dining room. Imagine this picture. Every evening there was a musical hour in the prison. Prisoners were allowed to play musical instruments. And while someone was tearing an accordion, playing a cheerful polka, the Maurice and Englins, covered with blankets, were hammering concrete with spoons for hours. The sound of the grinding was drowned out by the sounds of music. It was the most absurd escape symphony in history. To hide the holes, they made fake grids out of cardboard. But how to deceive the night guards, who looked into the cells every half hour? The decision was worthy of a Hollywood movie. In the prison barber shop, they collected their hair. They made mules of heads out of soap, toilet paper, and concrete. They painted them flesh-colored with paints stolen from the workshop. At night, before going to bed, they put these heads on pillows. In the dim light of the corridor with real hair, these dolls looked frighteningly alive. The guard shone a flashlight, saw the sleeping prisoner, and walked on. Behind the walls of their cells, there was an old abandoned service corridor. He became their secret highway. At night, they got out of the cell and climbed to the roof of the prison block, where they set up a secret workshop. Their goal was to build a fruit. From what? Out of 50 rubber raincoats, which they stole one by one for several months. They glued them together and vulcanized the seams by pressing them against hot steam heating pipes. To inflate this rubber monster, they remade the accordion concertina into a kind of bellows. On the night of June 11, 1962, everything was ready. They put the dolls in the bed, climbed through the holes, climbed up to the roof, and down the drainpipe. On the shore, they inflated their fruit and set sail into the black icy waters of the bay. No one else saw them. The next morning, the prison was on its ears. The FBI has organized one of the largest search operations in history. The official version is they drowned. But their bodies were never found. Legend has it that they survived. A decade later, a letter came to the police, allegedly from an aged John Englin, in which he confessed that they had all escaped. Whether it's true or not, no one knows. They simply disappeared, leaving behind spoons, a rubber fruit, and the biggest mystery in the history of prison escapes. Maurice and the Englins carefully planned their departure into the unknown, spending months on it. But our next story is about the unknown, which came by itself, without a plan. And a warning. It fell from the sky, leaving behind an unsolved mystery, and a fallen forest the size of a big city. Story number 22. The day when Taiga saw the second sun. Siberia, Podkamennaya Tunguska River Basin. June 30, 1908, 7 o'clock. Taiga slept a deep primeval sleep, in which one century is indistinguishable from another. And the wreaths hunters drove their deer. The air was clean and cold, and the silence was so dense that it seemed you could touch it. The world was eternal and unshakable. After 17 minutes, this eternity is over. A dazzling blue ball appeared in the sky from the southeast. He was brighter than the sun. It was rushing across the sky soundlessly, cutting through the atmosphere, leaving a trail of fire behind it. People hundreds of kilometers from the epicenter fell to their knees, deciding that the day of judgment had come. At an altitude of about 8 kilometers above the ground, the object exploded. First came the flash. It was such a force that a farmer in the village of Vanavara, 65 kilometers from the epicenter, felt his shirt catch fire right on his body. A shock wave followed. It brought down 2,000 square kilometers of forest to the ground. 60 million trees laid down like dominoes in a perfect radial order with their roots to the center of the explosion. Windows flew out in houses within a radius of 200 kilometers. The sound of the explosion, similar to the roar of 1,000 artillery pieces, could be heard 800 kilometers away. Seismographs in Irkutsk recorded an earthquake. But the strangest thing started later. The shock wave, having rounded the globe, was registered even in England. Over the next few nights, the sky over all of Asia and Europe shone with a mysterious silver light. In London at midnight, you could read a newspaper without a lamp. Years have passed, the First World War, the Revolution. The world was not up to the Siberian wilderness. It was only in 1927 that Soviet scientist Leonid Kulik, obsessed with the idea of finding a giant meteorite, reached the crash site. He expected to see a crater the size of a city, mountains of molten metal. He found nothing. Not a single shard, only millions of fallen trees. In the epicenter itself, where the force of the explosion was directed vertically downwards, the trees remained standing, but were completely stripped of branches and bark, turning into bare, creepy telegraph forest poles. What was that? A comet consisting of ice that has completely evaporated in the atmosphere, a collision with antimatter. An experiment by Nikola Tesla, a miniature black hole. For more than 100 years, not a single theory has appeared that would fully explain all the facts. Nature seems to have decided to play a cruel joke with humanity. She left a huge scar on the planet, but didn't bother to leave a note explaining. The sky left a scar on the earth, but it did not give answers. But sometimes the most disturbing mysteries are born not in the fiery sky, but in the sterile silence of hospital wards, where the human body itself becomes a source of inexplicable horror, turning saviors into anxious victims. Story number 23. The Smell of Death and a Syringe. Riverside, California, February 19, 1994. A typical evening in the emergency department. Doctors are joking tiredly, nurses are delivering medicines, the air smells of antiseptic and anxiety. At 9 p.m., a woman is brought to the hospital. Her name is Gloria Ramirez, she is 31 years old. She's in the last stage of cervical cancer. She is unconscious, her breathing is shallow. Her heart is beating intermittently. Doctors begin standard resuscitation. But from that moment, the standard procedures end, and the scientific horror begins. Nurse Susan Kane draws blood from Gloria's vein. She immediately notices the strangeness. The blood smells like ammonia. She hands the syringe to resident Julie McIntyre. It confirms a sharp chemical smell. Moreover, there are some whitish crystals floating in the blood plasma, similar to semolina. And then a chain reaction begins. Susan Kane, the first person to come into contact with blood, suddenly turns pale and faints. A few minutes later, Julie McIntyre complains of dizziness and nausea, and then also loses consciousness. Respiratory therapist Maureen Welch falls down after her. Panic begins in the department. People are falling one by one. The symptoms are similar for everyone: difficulty breathing, muscle spasms, dizziness, loss of consciousness. The hospital administration declares an internal emergency. All patients are evacuated to the parking lot. A team in chemical protection suits arrives at the hospital. They put the body of Gloria Ramirez, who died despite resuscitation, in an airtight container. That night, 23 people out of 37 employees of the department were injured. 5 were hospitalized. Julie McIntyre spent 2 weeks in intensive care with liver problems and necrosis of the knee joints. An investigation has begun that has generated more questions than answers. What was that? Mass hysteria, a toxic gas leak in the hospital, or Gloria Ramirez's body really turned in? Biological weapons. The main scientific theory put forward later sounds like a plot from the TV series The X-Files. Presumably, Gloria, suffering from pain, used dimethyl sulfoxide DMSO gel, which was illegally used as an analgesic, in her body due to kidney failure. It could transform into dimethyl sulfate, an extremely poisonous substance, a volatile poison. When doctors gave her oxygen and her blood cooled to room temperature, it could have triggered a chemical reaction, turning her blood into an aerosol poison. But this is just a theory. The official conclusion was mass hysteria. However, the doctors who almost died that night do not believe in this version. For them, Gloria Ramirez has forever remained a toxic lady. A woman whose death became one of the most terrible medical mysteries of the 20th century. Gloria Ramirez's blood became a source of danger, but the hero of our next story voluntarily turned his blood into medicine. He allowed the world's most venomous snakes to bite him hundreds of times so that his immune system would become a living factory. For the production of a universal antidote. Story number 24. The man whose blood became a first aid kit. Miami, Florida, 1948. The moist, sticky air of the South mixes with the smell of fear and reptiles. A crowd of tourists looks curiously into a concrete moat teeming with cobras, rattlesnakes, and African mambas. In the center of this tangle of death is a man. He is as calm as a monk in meditation. His name is Bill Hust. He is the owner of the Miami Serpentarium, and now he will do something that makes the blood run cold in the veins of even the bravest. He's going to milk a cobra. He slowly hooks the snake with a hook, gently takes it by the head, and brings it to a glass. The cobra opens its mouth, and 2 drops of thick yellow poison flow down the glass. The crowd applauds. They think it's just a stunt dangerous show. They don't know that this isn't entertainment for Bill Hust. This is his mission in life, his religion and his madness. Bill Hust has been obsessed with snakes since childhood, but he didn't just collect them. He believed that snake venom held the keys to the treatment of terrible diseases, polio, multiple sclerosis, arthritis. And to prove it, he began the longest and most dangerous experiment in history, putting it on the only object available to him on himself. Starting in the 40s, he began injecting himself with microdoses of poison. First cobras, then mambas, then kraits. He slowly, year after year, accustomed his body to deadly toxins. This process is called Mithridatism, but Hust has brought it to unthinkable heights. His immune system went berserk. She began to produce antibodies of such strength, and in such quantity, that his blood turned into a universal antidote. During his life, snakes bit him 172 times. Every bite that would kill an ordinary person in a few minutes, for him, was just another test for his immunity. He was losing a finger, his hands were swollen to the size of boxing gloves. He was on the verge of death several times, but each time his amazing body coped. Snakes, I must say, were not enthusiastic about his scientific research and expressed their opinions in the only way available to them. But that's where the madness turned into a miracle. When tragedies happened all over the world, a child in the jungles of Venezuela was bitten by a rare snake, for which there was no antidote, or a herpetologist at the zoo was struck by the venom of an exotic viper. A call was made to Miami. Bill Hust's blood was becoming the last hope. His plasma was frozen and sent by planes across the oceans. He personally saved the lives of more than 20 people, becoming for them a donor of not just blood, but life itself. Bill Hust lived 100 years. A man who flirted with death all his life, and voluntarily poured it into his veins, survived most of his critics, and died in his bed. Bill Hust turned his inner world, his blood, into a work of art that saves lives. But our next hero didn't look inside himself. He looked down at his feet from the garbage that others did not notice. For 33 years, he built the palace, which is still considered a miracle of architecture and stubbornness. Story number 25. The man who built skyscrapers out of shards. Los Angeles, 1921. Watts District. A dusty, poor place where dreams, if born, quickly die under the scorching California sun. Simon Rodia, a weary little Italian immigrant, lives here. During the day, he is an ordinary worker, puts tiles, interferes with cement, no one pays attention to him. But in the evening, when the city lights up, Simon returns to his tiny triangular plot of land and begins his real work, a job to which he will devote the next 33 years. The neighbors think he's crazy. Every day, returning from work, he does not rest. He wanders along railway tracks, through landfills, along beaches, collecting garbage. Broken glass from 7-Up bottles, fragments of porcelain plates, shells, rusty pipes, pieces of mirrors. He drags all this stuff to his house. And from this garbage, he begins to build. He has no drawings, no engineers, no construction equipment. He has only his hands, a bucket of cement, and a vision in his head. He begins to build delicate, dinosaur-like skeletons towers. The main material is steel reinforcement, which he bends with his bare hands, using the rails of the nearest railway as a lever. He doesn't use scaffolding. He climbs over his creations like a spider, climbing higher and higher, coating the rest of the frame with cement, and decorating it with a mosaic of collected fragments. The years go by. Children laugh at him and throw stones. Adults twist their finger at the temple. The authorities are trying to stop him, considering the buildings dangerous, and the towers are growing. They reach for the sky, sparkling in the sun with thousands of fragments, turning garbage into a work of art. The tallest tower reaches 30 meters in height of a 10-story building. He calls his creation Nuestro Pueblo, our city. This is his personal cathedral, built from the dregs of consumer society. In 1954, after 33 years of daily hard labor, 75-year-old Simon Rodia descends from his tower for the last time. He silently gives the plot to a neighbor, collects his things and leaves, never to return. He didn't explain his act, he just said, "I wanted to do something big. And I did." But the story didn't end there. The city authorities decided to demolish the dangerous towers. In 1959, they drove a powerful crane to them, tied them with cables and pulled. The cable stretched, creaked, and broke. The towers didn't even move. They turned out to be stronger than the engineers thought. This test of strength became their legalization. Today, the Watts Towers are a National Historical Monument, a symbol of the fact that one person, armed only with stubbornness and a dream, can build something out of garbage that will outlive him. Simon Rodia proved that it is possible to build a cathedral from the wreckage of other people's lives, which rushes into the sky. But our next hero built not from stone, but from sounds. He was trying to realize a language that would unite humanity. But instead, his creation became a target for the most brutal regimes in history, who saw the idea of universal peace as the main threat. Story number 26. A War Against the Language of Hope. Bialystok, Russian Empire, late 19th century. Imagine a cauldron city where Russians, Poles, Germans, and Jews are boiled in their own juice. They live on neighboring streets, but they speak different languages, look at each other with suspicion, and are ready to grab at the throat because of any little thing. In this atmosphere of mutual hatred, the idealistic boy Ludwig Zamingo grows up. He sees how the language barrier turns neighbors into enemies, and a dream is born in his head. The dream of a simple neutral language that would belong to everyone and no one individually. A language that would become a bridge between nations. For 20 years, he worked secretly on his project. Being an optometrist, he treated people's eyes during the day, and at night, he tried to give humanity a new vision, a new way to see each other. In 1887, he finally published his work under the pseudonym Dr. Esperanto. So the language of hope was born. Esperanto was ingeniously simple. Simple grammar, no exceptions, international vocabulary. The idea broke out like wildfire. Postgraduate clubs began to appear all over the world. People from different countries, who would never have been able to talk, suddenly started writing letters to each other, traveling, meeting at congresses. They felt like pioneers of a new better world, where there would be no wars, because everyone would be able to agree. They were as naive as children, and didn't know that tyrants hate universality more than anything else. Hitler struck first. In his book Mein Kampf, he called Esperanto the language of Jewish conspirators who want to mix nations and destroy the Aryan race. When the Nazis came to power, the hunt for graduate students began. They were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Zamingov's family was almost completely destroyed. Speaking to graduate students in Germany meant signing your own death sentence. But the irony of fate was that the same thing was happening on the other side of the barricades in the Soviet Union. In the 1920s, the graduate student was popular among the Bolsheviks, who saw him as an instrument of world revolution. But in the 1930s, Stalin changed his mind. He saw in graduate students a dangerous uncontrolled network of spies. People who corresponded with foreigners could not be loyal Soviet citizens. Mass arrests began. Esperantists were shot on charges of participating in an international espionage organization. Imagine the absurdity of the situation. The language created for the world became the cause of death. The Nazis killed for him because they thought he was Jewish. The communists killed for him because they thought he was cosmopolitan. The two most brutal regimes of the 20th century, hating each other, came together in one, in hatred of the idea of simple human communication. But the language survived, it went underground, outlived its executioners, and still exists as a quiet monument to the dream of a doctor from Bialystok. Zamingov tried to build a bridge between people, but his bridge was under fire. The hero of our next story was also building a bridge, but not metaphorical, but real. And to prove his reliability, he made his family stand under him, while a heavy train was crossing the bridge for the first time. Story number 27. A bridge held together by love and fear. Cincinnati, Ohio, 1889. The city is seething in anticipation of a miracle. Towering over the deep gorge of the Kentucky River is the Steel Monster, the tallest railroad bridge in North America. It's a fat, intimidating construction of iron and rivets that seems too fragile to withstand a multi-ton locomotive. People look at him with a mixture of admiration and horror. The newspapers are full of gloomy forecasts. The bridge will collapse at the first train, taking dozens of lives with it. The engineer who created this miracle is a German immigrant named John Roebling. Well, now he is busy with another project, the Brooklyn Bridge, and he commissioned his son Washington Roebling to finish the bridge in Kentucky. However, due to the Kessin disease, Washington himself is bedridden. And then a woman comes on stage who will go down in history as the first female field engineer. Her name is Emily Warren Roebling, Washington's wife. For several years, she has been in charge of construction. She studies Sapromat, transmits her husband's instructions to workers, solves the most complex engineering tasks. Male engineers look down on her, but she proves her competence. And now the bridge is ready. But the fear remains. The public does not believe that this web will survive. The railway company is nervous. Any disaster would be the end of their reputation. It was necessary to do something that would convince everyone of the absolute reliability of the bridge. And then Emily makes a decision that would make a modern engineer's heart stop. On the day of the first test, when two heavy steam locomotives had to drive slowly over the bridge, she takes her little son John Roebling, too, and stands with him right under the central arch of the bridge. Imagine this scene. Hundreds of people, holding their breath, watching from the shore. On the one hand, two smoking steam locomotives are slowly moving along the gorge. Their wheels clank onto the bridge. The structure begins to vibrate and hum, and at the bottom, at the most dangerous point, there is a fragile woman holding a child's hand. Her face is calm. She looks up at her family's creation. With this gesture, she says to the world, "I believe in this bridge so much that I am ready to put my child's life on the line. I believe in my husband's calculations. I believe in my work." Trains slowly cross the bridge. Silence is replaced by deafening applause and cheers. No one doubted the reliability of the bridge anymore. Amelia Roebling didn't just prove the strength of steel. She proved that sometimes the most convincing argument is not numbers and formulas, but boundless faith. Amelia Roebling risked everything for the future she was building. But our next hero didn't build anything. On the contrary, he destroyed. He destroyed the most guarded castles in the world to prove that any security system has a weak point. And this weak spot was called he himself. Story number 28. An artist whose stage was a prison cell. The end of the 19th century. The world is gripped by the fashion for spiritualism, magic tricks, and illusions. But among the hundreds of magicians who get rabbits and hats, a figure of a different scale appears. His name is Harry Houdini. He is not just an illusionist, he is an escapologist, a master of escape. His tricks are the awkwardness of his hands. It is a hymn to the human body, mind and will, which can overcome any chains, locks and walls. Houdini's fame thundered all over the world, but skeptics whispered, it was all rigged, the locks were filed, the assistants were bribed. Houdini decided to prove once and for all that he is the best. He has challenged all the prisons and police stations of the world. His standard number looked like this. He came to town, came to the local police department, and offered a bet. Put me in your best shackles, lock me in the most secure cell. And if I don't come out in an hour, I'll give you $1, The police, confident in their locks, gladly agreed. Houdini was stripped naked to make sure he didn't have hidden lock picks. He was chained, handcuffed, and sometimes even special transport shackles designed for the most dangerous criminals. Then they threw him into a cell and locked the steel door. Journalists and a crowd of onlookers were waiting outside. Several minutes passed, sometimes half an hour. And suddenly the door of the cell would swing open, and a smiling, completely naked Houdini would appear on the threshold, holding the removed shackles in his hands. Sometimes, to heighten the effect, he went out, and then, as a joke, locked his jailers in neighboring cells. The way he did it, it was a mixture of incredible physical fitness, brilliant knowledge of lock mechanics, and psychology. He could have dislocated his shoulder to free his arm. He could control every muscle in his body. But he hid the main weapon where no one guessed to look. He swallowed small lock picks and springs, and then vomited in the cell to get them. Sometimes he hid them under his fingernails or in his thick hair. His most famous prison escape took place in Washington. He was locked in a cell where Charles Guiteau, the murderer of President Garfield, was sitting. It was believed that it was impossible to escape from it. Houdini was released in 2 minutes. But one day he almost lost. In England, he was locked in a cell with a new clever lock that he could not open. An hour passed, and the crowd started laughing. Exhausted and humiliated, Houdini was about to give up when he simply pushed the door open. It turned out that the jailer, confident in the complexity of the lock, simply forgot to lock it. Houdini turned the humiliation of imprisonment into a triumph of freedom. He proved that the most reliable lock is the one that exists in our head. But our next hero wasn't trying to escape from prison. He tried to escape from the whole army, and for this he had to overcome the mountains, which were considered impregnable, leading not soldiers but war elephants. Story number 29 of the man who led the mountains to war. Spain, 2018 BC. Imagine an army stretching 4 kilometers, 90,000 infantrymen, 12,000 horsemen, and the most incredible 37 war elephants. These gray mountains of flesh and fury, encased in armor, were terrifying by their very appearance. At the head of this armada is a young Carthaginian commander. His name is Hannibal Barca. Since childhood, he swore on the altar that he would be the eternal enemy of Rome, and now he is going to fulfill his oath. Rome was confident of its invulnerability. From the south it was protected by the sea, and from the north by the Alps. An impregnable wall of ice was looking for, through which, as the Roman senators believed, even a goat would not pass, let alone an entire army. They were quietly waiting for Hannibal on the coast, planning to defeat him in a naval battle. But Hannibal wasn't going to play by their rules. He looked north at the white peaks of the Alps, and made a decision that is still considered the height of military madness and genius. He decided to bypass Rome from the rear through the mountains with elephants. The transition began, which took 15 days, and cost him half of the army. It wasn't just a hike, it was a battle with nature itself. Soldiers and animals scrambled along narrow icy paths, where one false step meant falling into the abyss. They were attacked by hostile mountain tribes, ambushing them and dropping stones on them. The elephants, unaccustomed to the cold and altitude, roared with fear and pain. They slid on the ice, fell, blocking the passage. Imagine this picture. African warriors in light clothes, accustomed to the heat, are trying to survive in an alpine blizzard. Hannibal led the way, encouraging his men, finding workarounds, personally cutting a passage through the ice. In one place, the road was blocked by a rock slide. According to legend, Hannibal ordered a huge bonfire to be built to heat the stones, and then burned them with sour wine, so that they cracked. When the exhausted army descended into the valley of the Po River in Italy, the Romans could not believe their eyes. The enemy appeared where it could not be. It was like seeing an enemy fleet landing from the moon. The panic that gripped Rome was comparable only to the genius of Hannibal. He passed through the Alps, losing almost all the elephants. Only one of his pets, Surus, survived, on which he left. But he achieved his goal. He brought war to the enemy's doorstep, and for the next 15 years tormented Italy, inflicting one crushing defeat after another on the Romans. Hannibal did not conquer Rome, but he went down in history forever as a man who proved that there are no insurmountable obstacles for a great goal, even if it is mountains. Hannibal moved mountains to wage war, but the hero of our next story moved mountains alone to pave the way to his village, in the name of love. This is a story about a man who for 22 years hammered a rock with one hammer and chisel. Story number 30 is a mountain that didn't know who it was messing with. India, Bihar, 1960. Giller village is a place that the gods forgot to mark on the map. Lost among the rocks, cut off from the world by a stone wall, she lived according to the laws of the Middle Ages. To get to the nearest town with a doctor, school or work, residents had to walk 55 kilometers around a massive mountain range. The mountain was not just a landscape, it was a sentence. She dictated who would live and who would die without waiting for help. Dashrat Manji lived here. He was from a lower caste, a poor man from the poor, a man whose existence meant nothing to the big world. But he had everything. His wife, Faguni Devi. Every day she made a dangerous crossing over a narrow mountain path to bring him lunch in the field. It was their ritual, their little one. Victory over the mountain. One day Fagunia didn't come on time. Dashrath, worried, went to meet her, and found her lying unconscious on the path. She slipped and fell. She was seriously injured and pregnant. Dashrath took her on his shoulders and ran, but had to run around 55 kilometers of hell. When he finally got to the hospital, it was too late. Falgunia died. On that day, Dashrath Hamanji's grief turned into a cold crystalline rage. He didn't curse the gods, he didn't blame the doctors. He looked at the mountain that had taken everything from him. He said softly, "Until I break you, I won't calm down." The next day, he sold his 3 braids, all that he had. With the money he got, he bought a hammer, a chisel and a crowbar, and went to the mountain. 22 years, imagine it, 22 years every day. From sunrise to sunset, one man with one hammer hammered the rock. At first, the village laughed at him. Manji had gone mad with grief, they whispered. Children threw stones at him. His own father begged him to stop this madness, but Dashrath would not listen. He was just working. He worked under the scorching sun, which melted the stones. He worked during the monsoon season, when torrents of water threatened to wash him into the abyss. When he had no food, he chewed leaves. When he had no water, he drank from dirty puddles. His body was covered with scars, his hands turned into solid callus. The mountain seemed not to notice his efforts, looking indifferently at this tiny, swarming figure. But a drop sharpens a stone, not by force, but by frequent falling. And then in 1982, after 22 years of a single war, the last stone collapsed. Dashrath Manji single-handedly cut through. There is a passage 110 meters long and 9 meters wide in the mountain. He shortened the way to the city from 55 kilometers to 15. One man, driven by love and rage, did something that the government would not have had the money or the will to do. He didn't just pave the way, he built a monument to the love, carved into the heart of the mountain, that dared to stand in his way. And this is where we close our archives. 30 stories, 30 proofs that reality is the most inventive, cruel and merciful screenwriter. We have seen how a man became a tree to deceive the enemy, how a dead queen took the oath of allegiance, how a drunkard in a prison cell experienced the apocalypse. We have learned that love can break through the rock, and the will overcome the stratosphere. The human spirit is the most unpredictable and indomitable force in the universe. He can build a palace out of garbage and lose the battle of a barrel of schnapps. He can survive in an icy hell and go crazy with a perfect memory. He can rule a non-existent empire and single-handedly defeat a mountain. I hope these chronicles have made you look at the world differently. After all, the most incredible stories do not happen on the pages of books, but right here, in this strange, frightening and beautiful world, where absolutely everything is possible. See you again in the twilight zone of history.